Your farm, you said, is part of the biosphere.
It is part of the biosphere.
What's your relationship with the biosphere? And I know you've been carrying on here, but you got brought into the biosphere, or did you start it, or how does?
No, I bought a property a number of years ago in the biosphere, but didn't know it was going to be proclaimed a biosphere. So wanted to be out the city, and wanted to wake up in the morning and see some zebra walking past. So I bought a small piece of land, game fenced it, and put a few animals on it. So it's one of those things where, we're all chasing our tails in life, and to be able to in the evening go home and to see the sunset, see the magnificent Mageliesberg, it was like the most prime thing that I could think about, besides being at the sea and looking out over the ocean. So that's why I wanted to be out, to be there, but at the same time it's close enough to the city. It's close enough to where one works, and more specifically in this case the Tshwane University of Technology, where I work and lecture in nature conservation. So it was like, this is close, and what a way to live. So that's how I got to be there.
And was it a biosphere when you bought it?
No, this was 10 years ago.
So when was it declared a biosphere?
Last year, June.
Ah, it's a new one.
It's a very new, yeah. So about 5 years ago, I heard that there was a group of people that wanted to, more specifically Vincent Carruthers had put a team together, and I was invited to be part of that team, which was really great, and started looking at, hey, should this not be a biosphere? And credit to Vincent and some of the other guys that put a lot of work into that, and eventually got a consultant in, and it was a very long process. It was a very difficult process. There were lots of hurdles to cross. It's government departments working with private sector. It took years, but the great news is it was declared.
And what did that mean to you when they came to you and said, "Oh, let's make this a biosphere"? Did that mean anything to you at the time?
That was incredible, because again, in the kind of work that I deal with, we lecture on national parks, in other words, formally protected areas. But again, national parks aren't the be-all and end-all of biodiversity and conservation. It's a very important component. But how do we as community live within this environment, and how do we make biodiversity part of our lives? So areas that are out of national protected areas, and specifically a biosphere, if one looks at the fact that you can actually have people living within this area. So you have your core area, which is untouchable, and then you have a buffer area and a transitional zone. And again, if we look into the future, how do we get to live within an environment which also looks after other species? So that to me was quite important. How can we be living near biodiversity, and everything from one of the big five all the way down to the smallest of animals. So that was kind of important for me, that was the aim of the biosphere, is to how does community live within an area and within a biodiversity area.
Interesting. Okay. I may ask questions that actually sometimes almost embarrass me, because I ask from a very ignorant point of view, ignoring the fact that I may have some pre-knowledge on this or my own personal perceptions on these things. But to play devil's advocate, you mentioned the magnificent Mageliesberg. Now, quite frankly, we've just driven sort of through it, and you see it from afar, and from the car it looks quite boring. It's not like driving through the Tsitsikamma forest or the Dragonflies mountains or the Cape Winelands. It's a big mound of brown grass.
Yeah.
What makes it so magnificent?
Well, you've got to live in the area to see the different aspects of it. And again, if you look at the biodiversity, you actually have the grasslands to the south, and you have the bushveld to the north, and you have montane areas within the cliffs. So
what's a montane area?
Mountainous vegetation, montane. So you have these three different biomes coming together. So from a biodiversity point of view, you're going to get a much higher species diversity, both in the plants and in the animals that inhabit the area. And again, if you look at it and if you're close to it and you get the opportunity to walk in it, you start experiencing this. So that's why it is a magnificent chunk of rock, the fact that it's probably over 2 billion years old is extremely important. It's supposedly the second oldest mountain in the world, 100 million years older than Mount Everest. And it was formed because of larvae coming up and causing the plates to tilt. So if you look at the Mageliesberg, if you look at the southern slopes, they are cliffs. If you look at the northern slopes, they are gradual. So it tilted. So between the Mageliesberg and the Witwatersberg, and there was a lake between it, it's actually tilted. So it's not tectonic plates, as in Everest. This is much older than that. So the history is absolutely incredible. So if you look at it from that aspect, then you look at it from the aspect of the culture of this area. What are the things that have happened here from the Stone Age, and the implements that have been found in this area? As we know, the cradle of humankind is part of it. So if you look at the cultural history, if you look at the biodiversity, put that all together, and the knowledge that every day, for instance, I look at this mountain, which is over 2 billion years old. It's a mind-blowing thought, and when the sun, obviously with sunrise, it hits the southern cliffs, and it's one of the most spectacular sunsets. So no, it's not just a blob of rock, as you say.
I hope not. You're working mostly on 2 species, right?
Well, as a veterinarian, you work on a number of species, but mostly mammals, the larger, more charismatic species. But we do deal with all sorts of species, including pythons and whatever presents itself. So as far as trying to provide a service to the call it the Mageliesberg community, the idea is to be on standby, and if anything goes wrong, let's say with the vultures, if there's a mass poisoning. So there has been a time where on the ground we've had 40 vultures lying, poisoned vultures, and trying to save as many of them as possible. So that's one of the problems that vultures have been facing in South Africa. A little less now, because a lot of work has been done by various NGOs in the area. There's Volpro, there's Endangered Wildlife Trust, there's BirdLife, there's the Wildlife and Environment Society. They've all been doing a lot of work, so we find less of that. We still find collisions with power lines as one of the problems affecting vultures of the area. And again, the history of a vulture restaurant is that climbers found chicks that when they'd fledged and jumped their nests, because you can imagine these guys, they're nesting on a cliff face that wide, 60 meters above some rocks, or 100 meters above. So in fledging, these guys had fallen to the bottom, and some climbers found it, took it, they analyzed what was going on, turned out to be calcium deficiency. So what you do is you provide a vulture restaurant with safe food and with bone chips, so that the vultures can come and pick up those chips, absorb the calcium themselves, again for egg production and for bone production for the chicks. So they would give bone chips to the chicks, because the chicks get to like 5 or 6 kilos. Now they have to fledge and jump the cliff for the first time. So their wings have to be strong. So they're practicing obviously on the ledges. So that's how vulture restaurants actually started. So, and now it's also important to have them going because of possible veterinary toxins getting, well, it's not toxins, it's actually veterinary drugs that are used on animals. And if those animals then die, the residues are picked up by vultures. So there's certain of those drugs which are fatal to vultures, and that's your non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. Voltaren was the first one. That was the cause of the death of millions of vultures in India and Pakistan over a very short period, over about a 12-year period. They lost 99% of all their vultures. So from tens of millions to a few thousand in the whole subcontinent of India and Pakistan.
And in terms of an ecosystem, what impact did that have? I mean, you've got a case study there of essentially the worst case scenario here. What were the results of that?
It was a massive impact on the environment. You can imagine now, both from a social point of view, because, for instance, your Hindu don't eat meat, so their cows are sacred. They try and keep them alive as long as possible. When they do die, they go to vulture restaurants, and the vultures come and clean it up. So that's hence tens of millions of vultures. Now what you had was piles and piles of meat rotting. So your feral dogs, your rat population just took off. It was absolutely mind-blowing.
Could something like that happen here if the vulture population were to die?
That was we were very scared. And that was there was a time when this information started coming out from India where actually the veterinary pathologists and epidemiologists thought it was actually a viral disease, possibly, because it was occurring all over the place and it seemed to be spreading. So we were actually going to do some work on some vultures here in South Africa to say, hey, we need to be prepared. We need to know what the normal blood counts are of normal vultures, because if we're going to get these animals coming in, we need to know what to compare it to. And then fortunately some very bright guys, it was an American who worked out that it was actually this drug. So he investigated it thoroughly. We then in South Africa did some tests. So it was together with ourselves, the University of Pretoria, Volpro. We did some tests and confirmed that it was the drug diclofenac. We also then tested other non-steroidal inflammatories, and we came up with a drug, meloxicam, which was available in India and which then had to be replaced. So because the Indian government was subsidizing a lot of these drugs for the cattle, for the Hindu. So by finding this out and publishing the information, the Indian Prime Minister actually took a decision to ban the distribution of diclofenac for animal use, which was fantastic, and then that to replace it with another drug, meloxicam, which is also available in South Africa. Since then, there's been work done at the University of Pretoria in the veterinary faculty related to other drugs like ketoprofen, which is also a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, which is also fatal to vultures if they eat a carcass which has been injected with that drug previously. So
what would be the consequence, say, of 99% of the vulture population in the Mageliesberg dying?
Yeah, so Mageliesberg is probably one of those colonies which we are keeping going through the vulture restaurant, which is supplying birds, because you remember once they fledge, they disperse. So dispersing to other parts of Africa. Now we know Southern Africa. Now we know, for instance, that there's problems. There's still quite a lot of poisoning problems, for instance, in Namibia, also certain parts of South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Zambia, southern part of Zambia. So by us keeping this population going, we hope to repopulate those areas where the vulture population has decreased. Now we know the function of a vulture is removal of carrion. So they go there once an animal has died and they clean up. It is also thought that they play a role in decreased disease outbreaks in animals, because you can imagine, more so the smaller animals, if they die, for instance, of a disease, anthrax, for instance, they can clean it up quite effectively. It's different if it's a much bigger animal, because then blood does get onto the animals and they do actually transmit that disease to a waterhole, for instance. But generally, the smaller antelope that might die of anthrax, they do decrease the amount of anthrax around. And of course, if you can imagine, if we see what happened in India, where certain other species then proliferate, and then we have an issue where they could, for instance, like if there's too many rats or feral dogs, because now suddenly there's meat all over the place. So typically your predators population goes up, and in our case, let's say in this area, it would also be feral dogs, feral cats, more rats, etc. So you then have a much bigger chance of diseases breaking out and other stock being attacked, let's say by feral dogs, etc. So they play an important ecological process, as does many other species within the environment. And it's not a good idea to take species out of that, the whole environment, the ecology, allowing your ecosystems to function. We do need as wide a variety of species as possible.
Because I suppose when you're talking about diseases, you're not just talking about animal transmission. I mean, if there are lots of feral dogs around, that could lead to rabies, which could then, that's a human problem. That then links those two societies quite strongly.
Yeah, and rats, you can think of the diseases that are carried by rats, and that would affect human populations. So again, what you need to do is keep the system as clean as possible. The vultures are there to clean the system up. and allow their natural processes to take place.
Amazing. Can you tell us again, just for the camera in the background, the story about the vulture that did his little tour around South Africa?
Okay, so we have, as part of our research, we've done various things. We put tags on vultures. So the idea being that if somebody somewhere sees a vulture, can write down the tag number and allow the researchers and the ornithologists to follow where the distribution of these birds, then we have a better idea of where they're going. So initially it was thought, well, maybe the vultures, just go from here to there, A to B. We didn't realize quite how far they travel. So by putting a GPS backpack with GSM cell technology, we were able to track an animal that basically went around South Africa. So we're talking about the Lowveld, up to Tabazimbi, into Botswana, down past Kimberley, down to the Cape, the Hoop, and back again. Probably over a 2 to 3 week period. This is how the bird flew. And what was amazing is that it seemed to go from colony to colony. It was like, going from city to city. So it was absolutely amazing. So obviously the communication that is taking place basically on a subcontinental scope is incredible. The way the birds communicate with each other, see what is where and who is where, and where should they be traveling to go and find other members of the same species. And so it's absolutely incredible.
Why would he do that trip? What would motivate
it? Could be part of a dispersal process where it was looking around. There could have been it could have headed up towards Namibia, to the Waterberg up in Namibia, where there are some Cape vultures there. It could have crossed over into Zimbabwe, southern part of Zambia. So by doing this kind of research from this place, we're able to see how far these animals do disperse, so to get a much better idea of where they are dispersing to, where the possible problems are. So you can imagine, if you're dealing with problems, what is killing vultures, which is even farm dams, for instance, these round farm dams where they sit on the side and fall in if the water's too low, to poisonings, to electrocutions. You want to know which areas to go and work in, so to prevent those animals being killed. Because remember, they only lay one egg per year, produce one. Look what happened in India. When are we going to get back to the position of millions of vultures again in India? It's going to be hundreds of years, if that is allowed to happen. So that was a huge knock that is going to take maybe centuries to return back to what it was. Will it ever get back to that? So we got to make sure that we don't get into that kind of situation where a knock over a short 12 to 15 year period can knock you back centuries related to a particular species. So that's why we have to research it. We have to know where they're going. We have to have an idea of what are the problems in those particular areas, so that the NGOs and the national park officials and nature conservation officials can work on it and help prevent unnecessary deaths.
And if they're traveling that much, I love that story. I enjoyed it as much the second time as the first. But if they're doing such big trips, then so far we've really been investigating, looking at each biosphere as an individual unit. But do biospheres there have a role or have a benefit of having a network of biospheres throughout South Africa in terms of animal distribution, animal travel?
I think there's certainly a bunch of species that will benefit tremendously from having a number of biospheres, because there are special areas from a biodiversity point of view. I think that certain species, and vultures would be one of them, there may be other bird species that would also be important, where they can be traveling from biosphere to biosphere. So, for instance, in the Lowveld, we know the Lowveld biospheres, we know there are vultures over there. They do come up from that area to our area. So there's a definite link in having a level of protection on the level of a biosphere protection that is going to link to other biospheres.
Changing track a little, I noticed in the video you had a WESA shirt on. Do you work for WESA?
Yeah, I'm currently a board member of WESA, so it's a voluntary positions on the board. And again, I think NGOs play a big role, especially in South Africa. We've got quite a few big wildlife NGOs, and I think it's very important that they be supported, and that places, for instance, like the Mageliesberg Biosphere is supported by volunteers from WESA. So in our snare removal exercises that we have, which was brought about by the whole Brandy the leopard story, we've had WESA volunteers coming out on the weekend. Why? Because they want to spend time in the magnificent Mageliesberg mountain range. Because it's a great place to come to on a weekend, because it's a great place to go hiking, mountain climbing, mountain bike trails. So it's interesting that we've had this for years, and that when you tell people, well, we've got leopards on the Mageliesberg, they say, but isn't that dangerous? But they've been there for probably centuries. So, and people have been mountain biking past them now for decades. So, and it's really interesting to see people's reaction to that. It's one of the big five, but they're a very low impact animal, very secretive, and it's great that we know they're there. They're part of that ecosystem, and it's right on our doorstep. It's right here next to Johannesburg and Pretoria. So I think the volunteers and more specifically the NGOs who can certainly benefit from coming out to the Mageliesberg and enjoying the environment, and at the same time doing a job, which is protecting some of the species of the biosphere, more so the antelope species, which is of course the food for the leopards. And so we have to be careful of things like poaching in South Africa, because it is on the increase. So we need to catch it while it's nip it in the bud, so to speak, so that we can protect this area. And we're finding that, for instance, WESA volunteers are playing an important role in that regard.
Quite supportive of the biosphere. How does that relationship work?
WESA is absolutely thrilled about the biosphere, because if one looks at protecting the environment or conserving the environment, again, we need to be able to utilize part of the environment, whether it's for commercial gain or just to be able to be out there to experience that wilderness aspect of the area. It's very important. So they're very supportive of that. And the more of these links we have between different biospheres, between different parks, and it also means that the biosphere must also integrate with national parks in the area or game reserves in the area. Like Pilanesberg is very close. So again, the benefit of having protection of species in the Mageliesberg, having the Pilanesberg Game Reserve and Madikwe and various other parks close by, I think that's the kind of, you want to link these islands, and you want to make the islands less islands. You want corridors between them. And again, the leopard, coming back to the leopard, is an ideal animal because it can cross tar roads. There are leopards in the cradle of humankind. There are leopards in the Mageliesberg, the Witwatersberg, and they are linking. And we can have it. It's a little more difficult with pride of lions. Certainly the human impact would be far too great. But the leopard is an ideal animal that links all the way from here, and probably very near to where we are sitting now. Leopards have passed here all the way to Pilanesberg.
Okay. That topic of corridors keeps coming up and up, and that's fantastic. As a landowner, private landowner within the biosphere, why are you supportive of the biosphere? Are you supportive of the biosphere, and why?
No, I'm absolutely supportive of the biosphere because, again, I want to A, live in this kind of environment, and B, leave it for a very long time into the future for other people to enjoy and for the species themselves. So by living in and actually owning a piece of land in the biosphere, for me, is very exciting. I think it ups the value of it because of the way we're thinking about it, the way we're thinking about the future. You know, the human population is exploding. We're over 7 billion people already. We've got to get to a place sometime in the future where we are integrated with biodiversity, where we can we can actually not only enjoy, also make a living within these areas without it or species going extinct or ecosystems. We want those ecosystems to still function.
Last question, and it's a stock question. In 30 seconds, can you explain what a biosphere is? Biosphere reserve specifically.
Okay, Biosphere Reserve is declared by UNESCO, Man and Biodiversity, so the MAP project. And it's a case of how do we have an area which is governed by various people, from private enterprise to government. How can we take an area that is of special importance from a biodiversity and from a cultural point of view? How can we integrate that into our living? And how can we have it there of benefit to the community and to the biodiversity at large?